The candles in the Ashworth ballroom had been burning for 3 hours when Marguerite heard her own name mangled for the second time that evening. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from practice, that no one in the room intended to get it right. She was standing 3 steps behind Lady Alderton's chair, her hands folded at her waist, her gown the color of pale straw, in a room full of sapphire and cream and gold. The orchestra was between pieces. The space where music had been was now occupied by the murmur of 100 conversations, and somewhere inside that murmur, a woman with a pearl aigrette was telling her companion that Lady Alderton's new girl was perfectly adequate, but rather plain for the season, and rather forgettable besides. The woman did not lower her voice. She did not need to. Marguerite was not the kind of person one lowered one's voice for. What she could not have known, standing there with her hands folded and her face composed into its careful quiet, was that the man who had just entered the room through the far door had heard the same remark and had stopped. James Fraser, the Duke of Ravenscroft, did not stop for ballrooms. He crossed them at a measured pace, acknowledged the necessary people, and departed before the second interval, a habit so well established that the hostesses of London had long since stopped expecting more. He was 34 years old, possessed of a face that the fashionable press described as carved, and of a reputation that his own mother described as appropriate. He had been announced 8 minutes ago. He had not yet moved from the doorway. His eyes rested, with an attention that looked like nothing at all, on the young woman in the straw-colored gown standing 3 steps behind Lady Alderton's chair. No one noticed. No one was meant to. Marguerite had come to London 6 weeks before the season opened, on the coach from Lincolnshire, with a trunk that held 2 serviceable day dresses, 1 gown she had retrimmed twice, a pair of gloves that fit almost correctly, and a letter from her father's solicitor confirming what she had already understood, that Richard Ashton's estate had been settled, his creditors paid in the order the law required, and that the outstanding sum of £4,200 remained unresolved against the family name. There was no family left to hold the name. There was only Marguerite, 23 years old, and the last of them, who had agreed with the practicality of someone who has had months to grieve and arrive at arithmetic, to enter Lady Alderton's household as a companion at £32 per year. £32. She had sat with the number on the coach journey south, turning it over in her mind the way one runs a finger along a hymn to find where it has frayed. It was not nothing. It was a very long way from something. Lady Alderton was 71, the widow of a baronet, prone to drafts and strong opinions and a comprehensive memory for other people's slights. She was not unkind to Marguerite. She was, however, absent in the particular way that wealthy elderly women are absent from the people they employ. She looked at Marguerite frequently, and saw her rarely. Marguerite understood this and did not resent it. She had come to London to earn £32 per year, and retire the slow arithmetic of her father's debt, and she did not require anyone to see her in order to accomplish this. The ballroom at Ashworth House was larger than anything she had entered before. The floors were pale and the mirrors were many, and the chandeliers held more candles than she could count without appearing to count them. She stood in her retrimmed gown and watched Lady Alderton accept a glass of ratafia and exchange pleasantries with a Mrs. Orr. Farquhar and Marguerite kept her posture straight and thought about nothing in particular except the correct angle of her hands. Then the Duke of Ravenscroft was announced, and the room shifted in the way that rooms shift when a genuinely powerful person enters, not loudly but all at once, every conversation adjusting its angle slightly toward the door. Marguerite did not adjust. She had no reason to. She watched Lady Alderton's expression brighten with the specific social hope of a woman who has an unmarried niece somewhere in the building, and she watched the crowd make its subtle adjustments, and she did not look toward the door. She felt the attention before she identified its source, a stillness at the edge of the room's motion, a quality of focus that pressed lightly against the side of her awareness. She did not turn. The evening continued. Lady Alderton was ready to be escorted to a chair nearer the windows, and Marguerite accompanied her, and that was all. It was not all, of course. The audience already knew that. She did not. The next morning, the housekeeper at Alderton House called Marguerite down to the drawing room to receive a visitor she had not expected. The woman who waited there was the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft, and she was seated in Lady Alderton's best chair, as though she had owned it for some years, and was merely tolerating its current occupants. Cecilia Fraser was 60 years old, and dressed with the particular precision of a woman who has never once worn a color that did not serve her. Her fan was ivory. Her posture was a kind of verdict. She looked at Marguerite for a moment, without speaking, the way one looks at a piece of furniture one is considering removing from a room, Miss Ashton, she said. She had been correctly informed of the name, which Marguerite registered as a form of warning rather than courtesy. Your Grace. Marguerite did not sit. She had not been invited to. I will be direct, the Dowager said, and the ivory fan opened and closed once, slowly. My son has been observed, attending to you on more than one occasion. I am aware that you are a young woman in reduced circumstances and that the season can present opportunities a prudent person might be tempted to pursue. I am here to ask you, as plainly as the situation warrants, to discourage any such pursuit. Marguerite's hands were folded at her waist in the precise position she had practiced, and her face was the face she wore in rooms where she was expected to remain invisible. She said very clearly, Your Grace, I have given the Duke of Ravenscroft no encouragement, nor do I intend to. That may be so, Cecilia said, and the fan opened again. But perception manages these matters, not intention. A girl in your position cannot afford the appearance of scheming, even when the reality is otherwise. She paused, and the pause had a weight to it. I am prepared to offer you 2 months' additional wages as a token of my appreciation. For your discretion. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the street below carried the ordinary morning sounds of a city, going about its work, a cart over cobblestones, a vendor's call, pigeons on the sill. Marguerite said, No thank you, Your Grace. The Dowager was still for a moment. The stillness had a quality she had not prepared for. I beg your pardon. I have done nothing that requires your appreciation, Marguerite said, and I would not wish to begin doing things that do. The Dowager departed 8 minutes later. She was not accustomed to departing without resolution, and what Marguerite read in her face as she passed was not anger, precisely. It was the recalibration of a woman who had just been surprised by a piece of furniture. That night, 3 floors below the room where Lady Alderton slept, and 2 floors below where Marguerite herself slept, the kitchen maid Agnes had a fever that had been climbing since the afternoon. The cook had given her a blanket and a cold cloth and instructions to rest, and Agnes had done her best, but the fever was the kind that produces a particular lonely helplessness in the small hours. And at 1:30 in the morning, Marguerite heard the sound of it through the floor. She went downstairs. She found Agnes on her narrow cot, awake and frightened, and she sat in the chair beside her and read aloud from a small volume of natural history she had found on the kitchen shelf, a book about the birds of the northern counties, which was neither comforting nor appropriate, but was the closest thing to hand. And Agnes did not appear to mind the subject matter. She fell asleep sometime around 3 o'clock. Marguerite remained until the fever came down. She did not know that the Duke of Ravenscroft had arrived late at Alderton House, detained by parliamentary business, to deliver a document his man of affairs had failed to deliver in the afternoon. She did not know that the footman had admitted him to the back hall, and that passing through it to reach the study, he had seen, through the half-open kitchen door, a young woman in a plain wrapper, reading aloud to a sleeping kitchen maid by a single candle, her voice steady and low. He had stood in the passage for longer than he intended. He had not announced himself. He had not done anything at all, except carry what he had seen with him, out into the cold of the night, and all the way back to Ravenscroft House, where he did not sleep particularly well. If you are finding Marguerite's story worth following, a like, or a comment will help this channel bring more stories like hers to the people who need them. Now stay with her, because the season is not finished with her yet. The days that followed carried the specific texture of a London season in full motion. Morning calls, afternoon promenades, evening engagements, stacked like pages in a ledger. Marguerite attended them all in her capacity as Lady Alderton's shadow, collecting shawls and finding seats and deflecting the hostesses who could not quite remember if Lady Alderton's companion was included in the invitation or merely attached to it. She was addressed on 3 separate occasions during this stretch as Mrs. Ashton, as if the Miss cost something to produce. James sought her out twice, and she did not understand either occasion as seeking. The first time was at a musicale at Compton House, where he crossed the room after the last piece to speak to Lady Alderton about a drainage matter on the old baronet's estate, which had nothing to do with Marguerite, who was standing to Lady Alderton's left holding her ladyship's lorgnette. He addressed Lady Alderton with the necessary courtesy, and then his attention moved briefly to the left, and he said, quite without inflection, Miss Ashton, as if verifying the name against some internal record. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at her for exactly the length of time that the social forms permitted, which was not long, and then he looked away, and Lady Alderton resumed the conversation about drainage. And the evening continued. The second time was in Hyde Park, where Lady Alderton took her morning airing in a carriage, and Marguerite walked alongside. He was on horseback. He came alongside the carriage to exchange pleasantries with Lady Alderton, as was proper, and the horse moved at the carriage's pace, which put him at Marguerite's shoulder for approximately 3 minutes. He did not speak to her directly. At one point, when the path narrowed, and a second carriage approached from the opposite direction, his horse stepped sideways toward the road to create space, interposing itself between the oncoming vehicle and the walking Marguerite. It might have been the horse's choice, it might have been the rider's. Marguerite noted it, and decided it was the horse's. She was not unaware of him. This was the difficulty. She was aware of him the way she was aware of weather, as something that required assessment rather than expectation. She was a companion at £32 per year who had arrived in London to manage the arithmetic of a £4,000 debt, and the Duke of Ravenscroft was the most powerful man in any room he entered. And she had lived long enough inside her own reduced circumstances to understand that awareness in one direction does not constitute attention. In return, she had read that lesson correctly. Everywhere it had appeared in her life. She read it here. She was wrong. She had no reliable way to know this. The Dowager was not wrong. She read the situation with the accuracy of a woman who had spent 40 years watching men of her family fail to conceal their interests from her, and she moved with the efficiency that comes from long practice. She called on Lady Alderton on a Tuesday with a specific warmth she rarely deployed, and the subject of her call was Lady Honoria Wycliffe, who was 22 years old, the daughter of the Earl of Wycliffe, and possessed of looks and a settlement that the Dowager described, with measured enthusiasm, as precisely suited to Ravenscroft's requirements. Lady Alderton was invited to the small dinner at which Lady Honoria would be formally brought into James's circle. Lady Alderton accepted with pleasure. It did not occur to her to specify that her acceptance did not include her companion. The dinner was at Ravenscroft House on a Thursday in late May, and Marguerite attended it, as she attended everything. 3 steps behind, folded hands, her face, the face she had learned to wear in rooms that did not require her. She watched Lady Honoria manage the table with the polished ease of someone who had been rehearsing for exactly this dinner since childhood. The girl was lovely. There was no other word for it, and she was also genuinely kind to Lady Alderton, and measured in her conversation with the Duke and Marguerite. Watching from the edge of the room during the interval, found that she could not think of a single objection to her except the one she was not entitled to hold. James moved through the dinner with the discipline of a man performing an obligation he understood clearly and felt nothing about, which was perhaps why he came to stand during that same interval at the edge of the room where Marguerite was standing. He was holding a glass. He was looking at nothing in particular. After a moment, without looking at her, he said, "You refused her, I am told." Marguerite understood immediately who he meant, and the fact that he knew it settled somewhere in her chest with a weight she did not examine. "I did," she said. "That was either very principled or very unwise," he said. "I suspected it was both," she said. He looked at her then briefly, and something in his face moved that was not the carved composure the rest of the evening had displayed. It was over quickly. The interval ended. He returned to the table. Marguerite returned to the edge of the room, and the dinner continued, and Mrs. Keisher. Farquhar, who had witnessed the exchange from across the room, stored it away with the particular attentiveness of a woman who makes it her business to understand what other people do not wish to be understood. It was 10 days later, in the carriage on the way home from a Mayfair card party, that the Dowager told James what she had decided. She had arranged it, carefully. The engagement between James and Lady Honoria was to be announced at the Sutherland Ball at the end of June. It was not a question. It was the conclusion of a process she had been managing for 2 seasons, and it was correct, and it was appropriate, and it would take care of itself. James looked out the carriage window at the London streets passing in the dark, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I have not agreed to this." Cecilia said, "You will." Her voice carried the specific confidence of a woman who has always been right about these things. He did not answer. The carriage continued. What his mother did not know, because he had not examined it clearly enough himself to name it to anyone, was that he had been sitting in the library at Ravenscroft House 2 evenings before, reading a letter from his man of affairs, and had found himself thinking about a woman reading from a book about northern birds to a sleeping kitchen maid at 3 in the morning. He put the letter down and stood at the window for some time. His first wife, Catherine, had been dead for 4 years. She had died in childbed during the night session of a parliamentary vote on a bill he had cared about deeply, and he had ridden through the following morning to reach Ravenscroft and found the house quiet in the way that houses are quiet when the thing that has happened cannot yet be spoken aloud. The baby had not survived either. He had stood in the doorway of the room where she lay, and the physician had said something that James had not heard, and he had understood with complete clarity that he had chosen the wrong thing, and that this particular choosing could not be managed or corrected or overridden by any subsequent effort. He had returned to Parliament. He had managed the estate. He had been correct and appropriate and capable in every particular that the Duke of Ravenscroft was required to be correct and appropriate and capable in. He had done this without ceasing, because ceasing was the one thing he could not afford to contemplate. He had not expected to be moved again. He had arranged, without admitting the arrangement, not to be. And now there was the image of the woman reading about northern birds and the memory of her voice saying, quite without seeking approval, that she would not wish to begin doing things that required appreciation. And the question he could not answer cleanly was, what he intended to do about either. He did not yet know. The season had 3 weeks left. The announcement was made on a Thursday, 2 days before the Sutherland Ball. Not at the ball itself, as the Dowager had planned, but at the small afternoon gathering she convened for the purpose with the right witnesses present, Lady Alderton among them, and Mrs. Farquhar, and 6 other women whose memories were the social infrastructure of the season. The understanding between the Duke of Ravenscroft and Lady Honoria Wycliffe was declared. It was done very correctly. Lady Honoria received the congratulations with her polished grace, and the Dowager presided with the satisfaction of a woman who has brought a difficult thing to its proper conclusion. Marguerite stood at the edge of the room and heard it. She looked at her hands. They were folded correctly. She told herself she was not surprised. She was right about that. What she did not anticipate was what happened 3 days later. Mrs. Farquhar came to call on Lady Alderton on a Saturday morning, with the specific purpose, thinly veiled, of reporting that it had come to her attention that the Duke of Ravenscroft had been observed showing particular interest in Lady Alderton's companion over the course of the season, and that this was being spoken of in certain circles as evidence that the companion in question had been conducting herself in a way that could only be described with regret as scheming. The word was placed with care. Lady Alderton's companion, Mrs. Malia, Farquhar said with a small pause, before the error she knew was an error, was clearly a young woman of limited means and fewer prospects, and it was a great pity that she had seen fit to pursue a connection so far above her station. Lady Alderton looked at her with the confused sincerity of a woman who had not been following the subtext. Then she looked at Marguerite. Marguerite looked back at her. With composure she had to reach for, and said, "I have pursued no connection. My lady, I have not had the occasion to do so." Farquhar's expression was kind in the particular way that is the opposite of kindness. "Of course not. I am sure it appeared quite differently from where you stood." The dowager had sent word that same morning. Marguerite learned from the housemaid who overheard it that a companion whose behavior had attracted unfortunate speculation could not continue in service to a household connected to Ravenscroft. Lady Alderton's companion, it was delicately indicated, would need to be replaced before the season's close. Lady Alderton, bewildered and gentle and wholly insufficient to the moment, told Marguerite that afternoon, with genuine regret, that the arrangement would conclude at the end of the week. Marguerite went upstairs to her room. She sat at the small writing table and looked at the slant of afternoon light on the wall for some minutes. Then she took out a sheet of paper. She was not appealing to him. She understood clearly that the engagement was public, and the dowager's power was real, and her own position was what it had always been. A young woman of no fortune and no family, in a city that required both. She was not writing because she expected anything in return. She was writing because there was one true thing she had not said, and she found, sitting at the table with the light on the wall, that she could not leave it unsaid. She had spent enough of her life being unseen without her own assistance. She wrote that she had not schemed. She wrote that she had refused the dowager's offer because it required her to accept a premise that was not true, and that she could not accept false premises, even comfortable ones. She wrote that she had watched him this season with more attention than was useful to her, and that she was aware this was precisely the kind of admission that would confirm every accusation made against her, and that she was making it nonetheless because she was leaving London, and she did not intend to carry the weight of the unsaid thing with her on the journey north. She wrote that she thought well of him. She wrote that she hoped he was happy in the life being arranged for him. She wrote that she was sorry about his wife, though she did not explain how she knew, because Mrs. Reha. Peel had told her in the kitchen the morning after Agnes's fever broke, speaking quietly and without being asked, that the Duke was a man who had made one terrible error, and had been paying it without ceasing ever since. She sealed the letter and gave it to the footman to be delivered to Ravenscroft House, and then she began to fold her 2 serviceable day dresses into the trunk. The Sutherland Ball was the last great occasion of the season, held in the largest private ballroom in London, lit by 400 candles and attended by a considerable portion of the people who mattered to the season's economy of verdicts. The Duke of Ravenscroft arrived at 9:30. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he arrived with a letter in his coat pocket, which he had read 4 times since the footman had delivered it 2 days before, and which he had been carrying since this morning, in the way one carries a thing that has not yet resolved itself into action. Mrs. Peel had come to him the previous morning. She had knocked on the door of his study, which she had not done in the 4 years since Catherine died, and she had stood on the near side of the threshold and said, without preamble, that she thought he should know that the young woman from Lady Alderton's household had read through the night to Agnes in the kitchen when the girl had a fever in May, and had refused a sum of money from the dowager, and was now being spoken of as a schemer. Mrs. Peel's face, as she said this, was the face of a woman who has decided that her loyalty belongs in this particular moment to accuracy, rather than comfort. James had looked at his housekeeper for a moment and then said, "I know." "Then you know more than you've acted on," she said, and departed. He stood in his study for some time after she left. The letter was in his pocket. He had known most of what it contained before he read it, because he had seen the woman it described. The knowing and the acting were different territories, and he had been standing at the border of the second one for 3 weeks, held there by the specific gravity of what had happened to Catherine, and the specific cowardice of believing that the only way to honor a mistake was to make the same mistake more carefully. He crossed the ballroom at the Sutherland Ball at 11:15, when the dancing had paused for the supper interval and the room was full of the kind of attention that a large crowd in a contained space produces when something unusual begins to happen. He had been at the far end of the room. He covered the length of it in 12 strides. People stepped back, not because he asked them to, but because his direction was evident and his pace was not the pace of a man who intended to stop. Marguerite had arrived at the ball as she had arrived at every other ball of the season, in the company of Lady Alderton. 3 steps behind her chair, her gown, the pale straw color she had worn to the first Ashworth ball. She was not attending as a guest. She was attending because Lady Alderton had a tendency to be unwell in carriages and required assistance getting settled, and Marguerite's position technically concluded at the end of the week, and not before. She had folded this into her composure, along with everything else, and stood at the edge of the room, with her hands correct and her face correct, and the specific weariness of a person who has decided what to do and is waiting for the practical business of doing it to begin. She saw him coming before most of the room did. She saw him come through the crowd, and the crowd parting around him, and she watched him come and understood, quite precisely, what was happening, and found that her hands were no longer folded. They were at her sides, and she was standing very still. The sound of the room had gone distant, in the way sounds do, when something more immediate demands the full attention of the body. He stopped in front of her. The room had noticed. The room had arranged itself, with the swift collective intelligence of a crowd that recognizes a scene, in a rough circle around the two of them, far enough to maintain the fiction of not watching, close enough to hear. The dowager was at the far side of the circle. Marguerite did not look at her. She looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the letter she had written. He did not unfold it. He held it with both hands and looked at her, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, which was to be entirely honest with her. "I have read this 4 times, he said. His voice was level and quiet, audible in the specific hush the room had produced around them. She said nothing. She was waiting for the rest of it. "You wrote that you could not leave a true thing unsaid," he said. "I find myself unable to be less honest than you were." He paused. The pause had nothing practiced in it. "I am not engaged to Lady Honoria Wycliffe. I declined to confirm it this morning. Lady Honoria is aware of this, and has been, I believe, relieved." He said this simply, as one states a fact. "I chose the wrong thing once in my life, and I have been paying that debt in the wrong currency ever since. I chose duty over a person I should have been present for, and I told myself that choosing duty again more carefully would constitute some kind of restitution. It does not. It only constitutes the same error." The room was very quiet. A candle somewhere above them made a small sound against its glass. "I am asking you," he said, and he said her name, her full name, Marguerite. Clearly and deliberately, in a room where she had been addressed as Mrs. Ashton and Lady Alderton's girl and the companion and not quite visible, to consider remaining in London, not in Lady Alderton's household, in mine, as its mistress, if you are willing. It was the simplest public declaration she had ever heard, and it was the most costly one. And she stood in its wake for a moment that felt longer than it was. She was not a woman who permitted herself easy things. She was a woman who had arrived in London with a retrimmed gown and £32 per year, and the arithmetic of £4,200 pressing on every decision she made. She was a woman who had refused a bribe, and read about northern birds and written an honest letter and expected nothing from it except the particular peace of not carrying the unsaid thing north with her. She said, "I would have to think of my father's debt." "It is managed," he said, and then reading her face correctly, he said, "by my man of affairs this morning, as a matter that touches the estate, not as a condition of this conversation. The two things are separate." She looked at him for a moment more. Then she said, "Yes." The word was not loud. It reached the room nonetheless. What happened in the following minutes was the period's particular ceremony of public reckoning, which is less dramatic than silence requires it to be, and more consequential than noise permits it to appear. Mr. D., Mr. Prax. Aldous Crewe, who was present at the ball in his capacity as the Duke's solicitor, was brought forward from his position near the doorway by a word from James, and he confirmed, briefly and precisely, that the morning's proceedings had been concluded in proper form, and that Lady Honoria had been informed with appropriate care. The thing was done legally and correctly, which was how James did everything, including this. Lady Honoria was near the far windows, and she withdrew from the scene with the grace of a young woman who had understood, for several weeks, that the ground beneath the arrangement was less solid than it had appeared. Her face as she withdrew was not the face of a broken heart. It was the face of someone arriving with some relief at an ending she had been anticipating. The dowager did not withdraw. She remained at the edge of the circle, her fan held at its measured height, and she looked at Marguerite, and the thing that moved through her expression was not defeat, precisely. It was something older and less comfortable. She had protected the order she understood, because it was the only order she knew how to protect, and it had been overridden not by a challenge to its premises, but by a man whose judgment she had trusted, standing in the center of the ballroom she had managed for 30 years, and choosing differently. She said nothing that evening. Later, privately, she would tell her son that she had perhaps not accounted for certain qualities she had lacked the information to assess. This was the closest she could come to it, and it was in its way sufficient. The crowd resumed itself, the orchestra returned from its interval. The season had 2 days left, and 2 days later it ended, and London released its annual grip on the families who had come to it, and the coaches and carriages and hired post-chaises rolled north and south and west, carrying with them the season's verdicts. Marguerite's verdict was different from the one she had brought south with her. They were married in September by the vicar at the church nearest to Ravenscroft, with Mrs. Peel and 3 of the estate's senior staff as witnesses, and Lady Alderton, in the front pew, wearing a hat she had bought for the occasion, and crying into it with the sincere emotion of someone who had not entirely understood the situation, but was deeply moved by its resolution. Mr. Crewe stood at the back, his paperwork in order, and smiled once. When the register was signed, Ravenscroft in winter was not what she had imagined, because she had not permitted herself to imagine it. It was large, in the way that places are large when they have been built across several generations, and each generation added something the previous one had not thought of, with corridors that went unexpected distances, and rooms that opened onto other rooms, and a library on the east side of the house that held, she discovered in November, an entire shelf dedicated to the natural history of the British Isles. The book about the birds of the northern counties was in the second row. She recognized it from the kitchen shelf at Alderton House, and spent a long moment trying to understand how it had arrived here, before Mrs. Peel appeared in the doorway and said, with perfect composure, that she had thought it belonged here, and had taken it with her when she came, and had placed it where she thought someone might eventually wish to find it. The winter came early and heavily to the north that year. By December, the grounds of Ravenscroft were white to the tree line, and the windows of the house were thick with cold at the edges, and the fires in the main rooms burned through the afternoons and into the evenings, casting the particular amber light that Marguerite had not associated with her own life before, and was learning, slowly, to receive. On a Thursday evening in the second week of December, she found James in the library. He was standing at the window, looking out at the snow, which was falling again, steady and unhurried across the grounds. He did not hear her at first. She stopped in the doorway and watched him, and he was a man standing at a window in the house he had inherited, and then emptied, and was now, by slow and effortful degrees, refilling. She came to stand beside him. Outside, the snow continued. The grounds were entirely white, and the trees at the tree line held their bare arms up against the dark sky, and the light from the window fell across the first few feet of snow, and illuminated the ground in a long, warm rectangle. He turned toward her then, and the thing in his face was the thing she had seen at the Sutherland ball, the particular honesty she had not expected and had not been able to refuse. On the mantelpiece behind them, held upright against the base of the clock, was the letter she had written at the small table in Lady Alderton's house on the afternoon she expected to leave London. He had placed it there himself the first week of their marriage, without explanation, and she had not asked for one, because the placing of it was its own explanation. The ink of it was visible across the room, her handwriting small and neat and characteristically measured, the letter of a woman who had decided to say a true thing once and accept the consequences. The fire settled in the grate behind her. The snow fell outside the window. She had come to call her own. She was home. If Marguerite's story stayed with you, leave a comment with the moment that caught you most. And if you would like more stories of women who endure quietly until the world finally looks their way, this channel has more of them waiting for you.